In this session, we've got one more paper before you get your lunch break. And it's my pleasure now to welcome Salvador Ryan. Salvador is Professor of Ecclesiastical History in St. Patrick's College, Maynooth. And today he's going to be exploring the question of the effect of COVID-19 on religious practice in a paper entitled The Final Rupture, COVID-19 and Popular Religious Practice. So thank you. I'll hand over to you, Salvador.
Thank you very much, Jesse. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, you're very clear.
Great, excellent. Okay, so it was a few days before Christmas 1987, and a close friend and neighbor of ours had arrived at the doorstep laden down with gifts. I still remember my mother opening up the large box, which contained some exquisitely patterned dinnerware. Nothing as fancy as this had ever crossed the threshold of our kitchen. There were also some chocolates, the customary tin of biscuits, probably afternoon tea, and a carefully chosen Christmas card. But wait, there was something else, a smaller box, and whatever it contained felt a little heavy in a 12-year-old's hands. As fingers scrambled to tear away the festive sellotape and unseal the flaps, we found that the little box contained a bundle of softback books, bound together with string. They seemed to be part of a set. Laid out on the table, their titles revealed themselves to us. All About the Angels, The Wonders of the Holy Name, Read Me or Rue It, How to Be Happy, How to Be Holy, An Easy Way to Become a Saint, and How to Avoid Purgatory. Okay, Christmas gifts were a little bit different in mid-1980s Ireland. Now, they were all by the same author, EDM, Enfant de Marie, that is Father Paul O'Sullivan, a Kerry Dominican, who'd spent much of his religious life in Lisbon, where he'd established a Catholic press with a view to releasing short catechetical and devotional works to reignite the faith in his adopted land. But they'd also made their way back to Ireland, and in 1987 they were still being sold in the St. Martin Apostolate in Parnell Square in Dublin, site of the famous moving crib. The shiny covered books, which reflected the fairy lights of the Christmas tree under which they sat, were immensely appealing to the eye, and I soon found myself picking up the largest. It promised to teach the following: how to be happy, how to be holy. I opened the cover and flicked through the first few pages. Now, when future historians come to write the history of Irish Catholicism in the 21st century, it's very likely that the year 2020 will serve as a marker of profound religious change. It will take its place along with 1850, the date of the Synod of Thurles, but more importantly, shorthand for the beginning of the so-called devotional revolution, which transformed religious practice in Ireland. 1932, the Eucharistic Congress, which gave the fledgling state a world stage on which to exhibit its Catholic identity. 1979, the visit of Pope John Paul II, which numerous commentators today regard as Irish Catholicism's swan song, even if many contemporaries never guessed it at the time. 1992, the breaking of the Bishop Eamon Casey story, which seemed to precipitate a torrent of revelations of double standards, abuse, and cover-up over the succeeding decades. 2011, the year in which an Irish Taoiseach, Enda Kenny, delivered a fiery speech of unprecedented candour, denouncing the dysfunction, disconnection, elitism and narcissism of the Vatican in what he claimed was an attempt to frustrate the Klein inquiry. And finally, the visit of Pope Francis to Ireland in 2018, which, despite him being one of the most popular popes of recent memory, yet failed to ignite the enthusiasm of Irish Catholics, thousands of whom chose instead to stay away. Now, these are all defining dates in the history of Irish Catholicism, but 2020 may very well be the most defining date of them all. Despite lacking the triumphalism of 1932, the showmanship of 1979, the shock of 1992, or indeed the raw passion of 2011, it may yet be that the events of 2020 have the most far-reaching consequences for religious practice in Ireland. But 2020 was far in the future for a 12-year-old boy holding a book written by a long-dead Kerry Dominican in the days leading up to Christmas of 1987. What I was about to discover was that every single day that I woke up was an opportunity for me to join in the most noble enterprise that one could imagine, a universal apostolate of prayer that had nothing less than the whole world in its sights, not to mention the realm of the dead who had long since passed from this world. And all one had to do was to sanctify the bits and pieces of everyday life by turning them into countless small offerings to God, as recommended in the line of scripture, which was positioned underneath the author's name on the book's title page. Pray without ceasing. The key to achieving this was to begin well upon waking in the morning. Here's what O'Sullivan had to say about that staple of Catholic daily prayer, the morning offering. He said, "This act is short, but we should say it with full deliberation. It is of the highest importance, for it transforms every act of the day, every work, every suffering into an act of love we can thus perform. What immense graces we shall receive, what glory we shall give to God. And if we do not make this short act, what thousands of graces we shall lose every day. But can there be any doubt of this fact? None whatever." Now, while the assuredness of the assertion was very much of its time in such spiritual writing, when one gets past the style, O'Sullivan was simply emphasizing how natural it can be to sanctify the various elements of one's day by consciously turning each of our acts towards God. Incidentally, I remember around the same time hearing it said of an older neighbor of ours at home that when he'd get up in the morning, you wouldn't get so much as a bye or leave from him until he'd kneel down at the bed and recite his morning offering. But O'Sullivan also asked his readers to repeat this offering at various points during the day. For instance, when walking, to say, "Oh my God, I wish that every step be an act of love for you." When writing, "My God, every word I write, I wish to be an act of love for you." When sewing, to say, "Oh my Jesus, I wish that every stitch I give be an act of love for you." Now, it's all too easy today to smile at such pious practices. However, to do so would be to miss their fundamental point. A healthy spirituality does not compartmentalize communication with God by confining it to places that are considered to be sacred, while relegating all other areas of our lives to the realm of the profane. That's hardly incarnational theology. By contrast, what O'Sullivan was proposing in his homespun style was that there are no areas of our lives which can't or shouldn't be brought to God in prayer, and the recitation of short aspirations, as they were known then, was one of the means by which one could do so. Now, as a 12-year-old boy, I couldn't have described his approach in precisely those terms, but the lesson wasn't lost on me. Now, the spirituality found in the works of Father Paul O'Sullivan is emblematic of a period of Irish Catholicism, often closely identified with the decades before the Vatican Council, Second Vatican Council, but also post-dating it, in which a plethora of pious exercises and devotions were part and parcel of everyday life. There were 40 hours, benediction, Corpus Christi processions, May altars, First Friday devotions, novenas to various saints or for the holy souls, men's and ladies' retreats, parish missions, pilgrimages to Knock, Crowpatrick, Loch Derg, and later to places such as Lourdes. But devotion is first nurtured in domesticity. It's where practice becomes habit, and habit becomes a way of life. For all its deficiencies, and there were many, pre-conciliar Irish Catholicism was not confined to the experience of the Sunday liturgy. Catholic family life was subsumed in religious iconography, and one's day was punctuated by domestic ritual. There were morning and night prayers, and the Angelus bell called people to pause in prayer at noon and 6 o'clock. The customary grace before meals was encouraged, or at the very least in some households, a hastily made sign of the cross. And then there was the recitation of the rosary, which was a staple practice in a great many Catholic households, although by no means all. But even when we weren't actively praying, we were encountering the sacred at every turn. Whether that was the brown scapular that one wore around one's neck, or the miraculous medal, or the feel of the rosary beads in one's pocket, or the dipping in and out of the holy water font in our comings and our goings, or the habitual sprinkling of some excess holy water to ease the suffering of the poor souls in purgatory. But it was also in our everyday speech. God save all here. God bless. God be good to him, or God be good to her. God bless the work. God between us and all harm. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, and so on. There were prayers to St. Joseph for a happy death, prayers to our guardian angels for protection, to St. Anthony for lost items, St. Jude for hopeless cases, and if you're a pioneer, which many were, a daily pledge to the Sacred Heart to abstain from all intoxicating drinks. Most of the time, often unconsciously rather than consciously, we lived and breathed a Catholicism that was interwoven with everyday life. And while that culture of Catholicism is often associated with a pre-Vatican II church, it certainly didn't cease to be in the 1960s. Indeed, the remnants, although becoming increasingly fragmented by this stage, were still to be found in the 1980s in rural Ireland, and the rural Ireland of the 1980s in which I grew up. This was a time when busloads of Irish adult pilgrims to Marian grottos, for instance, could petition the Virgin Mary to favour their day with a pleasant surprise. O Mary, my mother and Our Lady of Surprises, what a happy joy you caused the wedding guests when you asked your divine Son to work the miracle of water into wine. What a happy surprise for them, since they had thought the wine had run dry. I too, Mary, love surprises, and as your child I ask you to favour me with one today. I ask this only because you are my ever-caring mother. Now, this is not a sophisticated prayer, but it's a heartfelt one. And it asks not for a great miracle of healing or the transformation of a difficult situation, but simply for a gentle inbreaking of divine favour to temporarily lift the humdrumness of everyday living. Some might regard such a prayer with scorn. Why bother the Mother of God with such a trivial request? And yet, prayers such as this affirm that there is nothing so trivial in one's daily life that cannot be presented for God's blessing. The variegated tapestry of popular devotions that was a feature of pre-conciliar Catholicism afforded the laity a degree of agency in their spiritual lives at a time when they were largely excluded from full and active participation in the liturgy. Indeed, the reform of the liturgy, which culminated in the Second Vatican Council's Sacrosanctum Concilium, stated that in the restoration and promotion of the sacred liturgy, this full and active participation by all the people is the aim to be considered before all else. For it is the primary and indispensable source from which the faithful are to derive the true Christian spirit. No longer was it deemed fitting for attendees at Mass to quietly finger their beads or leaf through their prayer books in the pew, while the priest got on with what was regarded as being his duty alone. The liturgical reforms of Vatican II provided a necessary corrective to what was now often dismissed as an overly privatized piety of the past. For many of the liturgical reformers of the 20th century, the problem with many popular devotions was that they provided a very poor substitute for active participation in the Church's liturgical and sacramental life. And although Sacrosanctum Concilium commended popular devotions, this need to correct a long-standing imbalance in the religious practice of Catholics would, in conjunction with wider changes in society and culture, unwittingly create a perfect storm of suspicion and sometimes of denigration of many elements of popular piety, which would come to be grudgingly tolerated by some and counted as risible relics of a theologically impoverished past by others. Furthermore, the reaction against excessive legalism and scrupulosity of the past led also to an inevitable loosening of devotional belts. Was it really that big a deal to miss out on reciting one's morning and evening prayers? To tuck into one's dinner before saying the customary grace? To dash out the door without dipping one's fingers in the holy water? To pass a church or a graveyard without blessing yourself? To neglect to wear a sacramental such as a scapular or a medal? Surely it would be embarrassing in this day and age to suddenly fall silent and to recite the Angelus when in company if you heard the church bell ring. Was God really that bothered about these little things, these rituals that one often performed by rote, even mindlessly? Was it not better to fully devote one's attention to these matters in their proper place, their designated devotional area? And increasingly, as the decades wore on, and the family rosary now inconveniently clashed with Coronation Street, that designated devotional area increasingly became a designated liturgical one. That is, attendance at Sunday Mass. This, at least, was the one time in the week into which a person could plough his or her pious energies. And after all, didn't the Second Vatican Council in its dogmatic constitution, Lumen Gentium, state that the Eucharist is the fount and apex of the Christian life? Surely this was a case of choosing the better part. And yet, very soon, it became the only part. There's no doubt whatsoever that the increased participation of the laity in the liturgical life of the Church post-Vatican II was a very good thing. And numbers of Irish Catholics attending Mass remained remarkably high up until relatively recently. The problem was that other forms of devotional life began to wane, whether those in church, such as benediction, or various novena devotions, or at home, such as morning and night prayers, the recitation of the family rosary, the use of sacramentals, the use of holy water. As a result, the single weekly point of contact with the expression of faith came to be one's attendance at Saturday evening or Sunday Mass. And despite the increased participation that the reforms of Vatican II brought in, this was nonetheless a liturgical celebration that couldn't take place without the priest. A layperson might proclaim the word in the readings, might lead the congregation in song, might assist in the distribution of Holy Communion as a Eucharistic minister, but ultimately it's always the priest who presided. Over time then, despite the widespread caricature of the pre-Vatican II Church being a clerically dominated one, it's actually the post-Vatican II Church which has witnessed a silencing of the laity, in particular in the domestic setting, albeit one that it never intended. With the gradual disappearance of the vestiges of domestic devotion in more recent years, however, the role of the laity in general, and indeed women in particular, in both structuring and leading religious practice in the home has also dissipated. Along with that came a reinforcement of the idea that it was predominantly the priest's role to lead the people in communal prayer. I remember some years ago, my own parish priest received a call on his mobile when he hadn't arrived on time to say the rosary at the house of a deceased parishioner. "'Tis 9 o'clock, Father," one of the neighbours explained over the phone. "Oh, I'm so sorry," he said. I just got delayed. I'll be there as soon as I can." "But Father, we're waiting for you to say the rosary," the neighbor continued. A little exasperated, the priest replied, are there no other Catholics present that could recite it in the meantime?" This priest in question was a great enabler of lay participation at all levels. He simply couldn't understand how a large group of parishioners needing to recite a familiar prayer could experience such a state of paralysis in the absence of a priest. Now, questions such as these are the inevitable consequence of a long process of disengagement with domestic devotion, something which has left us indeed far more dependent on our clergy than we ought to be in an era when the universal call to holiness is particularly emphasized. One simply cannot imagine this situation arising in the pre-conciliar period in a domestic setting. As Eamon Duffy, the Cambridge historian, has noted, our predecessors often got the theological formulae wrong, as we in turn will no doubt do, but they knew how to pray. We can still learn from them. In March 2015, in preparation for the Limerick Diocesan Synod in the following year, I was invited to give a talk to some delegates, which included a reflection on some of the contemporary challenges that the Synod might address. Having delivered an overview of the history of Irish Catholicism as it has evolved over the centuries, I clearly remember asking the following question. I asked, would we miss it, that is Christianity, the practice of our faith, if it was all gone away in the morning? The answer may be alarming. In fact, experience tells us that many people who walk away simply don't. And yet they should. We should. If one decides to leave a sumptuous table and to abstain from its delectable fare, surely one must starve, or at the very least, suffer malnourishment. But so often that is not the case. Why? Could it perhaps be that the food wasn't so sumptuous after all, the table wasn't so sumptuous, or that the food was very badly cooked? Now, little did I realize back then, 5 years ago, that 5 years later, so many of us would experience precisely that, it all going away very suddenly. But it didn't all go away, surely, did it? All that happened was that many of us were deprived of the opportunity to attend Mass in person as usual on a Sunday. But my question is, with the removal of attendance at Mass from our weekly religious practice, what was left? By 2020, for many Catholics, but by no means all, Sunday Mass was the last vestige of religious practice. If in the decades following Vatican II, for all sorts of cultural, societal, and even religious reasons, we had participated in a religious rupture, a large-scale jettisoning of devotional practice in the home, and that there was a much reduced menu of non-liturgical communal devotions on offer besides, then the Sunday Mass inevitably became that which many still clung to, even if at a time of a flood of clerical scandals, it was by their very fingernails. And then COVID hits. Very soon there's a lockdown and we can no longer attend the liturgy in person in our churches. The clergy in our parishes respond as swiftly and as generously as they can in transitioning to the provision of streamlined masses. The national broadcaster also responds unstintingly in allowing viewers to get their daily Mass. Many parishes enthusiastically report encouraging figures tuning in. However, there are also numbers of Mass-goers who don't. It's just not the same. It's now been a good few months. It's going to be a year in March. And there are many who haven't attended Mass since. And given the fact that the sky hasn't fallen in, many within this category may in fact never return. Might 2020 then be the year that marks the final rupture in the history of Irish Catholicism? Could a global pandemic finally do for some, especially those still barely clinging on, what almost 3 decades of scandalous revelations failed to do? Like a swift December breeze sweeping away the last of the autumnal leaves. What is for sure is that the first rupture has not helped us in our coping with the prospect of a possible second. A healthy Christian life cannot sustain itself by simply leapfrogging from Sunday to Sunday without anything in between. By doing that, it's simply bone without cartilage. To become truly COVID-proof, we need both. What we celebrate in the Sunday liturgy should naturally overflow into our weekly living, our communal worship, and our domestic religious practice, becoming for us a seamless garment. Domestic devotion offers us an opportunity to embed in our daily lives rituals that will carry memory and meaning for the long haul, and may, at least in part, sustain us in times of Eucharistic famine. In this time of COVID, with no clear end yet in view, we may need to return to the site of that first rupture to find the clues necessary to avoid a second. Thank you.
Thank you, Salvador. An interesting mix of highly entertaining and very, very challenging.
Yes, I mean, short answer is yes. I think, you know, speaking of that seamless garment, I mean, one feeds into the other. Surely, I mean, what you do at home, whatever devotional practices you practice at home, they ideally, at least, they should sustain and nurture and nourish and better presuppose or predispose us towards what we do in the liturgy. One isn't divorced from the other, or certainly ideally shouldn't be divorced from the other. If they are, there's something wrong. So certainly within our tradition, one should be supportive of the other, certainly.
There's perhaps time for one more quick question or comment.
Perhaps we have to broaden perspectives from the point of view that we're only at the early stages of weaving this new garment. I don't actually see as this is the year or last year of COVID. I think COVID and all the limitations will actually last a number of years. And so perhaps what we should be more hopeful is that people are beginning, because of limitation, to weave a new relationship that allows them to have almost the reverse of what's gone wrong. I've actually come across a number of people who are not Catholic, who are actually turning to the Catholic Church online. Neighbours, friends have said, there's something that I didn't have access to before that I can add into my daily prayer. And so I think what we need is a more hopeful, but also to be much more aware of these are the very, very early days of creating a new religious way of living.
Absolutely, Eileen. Thank you so much for your comment. And that's why, in fact, my article in the volume, and I hope the promo for this talk here this morning, when it says the final rupture, there is very much a question mark after that. You know, does 2020 mark the beginning of the final rupture? But that's very much a question. And at the end, I think, of the presentation, I would have said that, look, if we are to avoid that final rupture, maybe the key to avoiding it is to go back to that first rupture and see what happened with that first rupture. And it's not a case, I mean, I'm not advocating for 1 second that we reinstate all of the traditional devotions that worked in the 50s and the 60s and 70s. I'm not necessarily saying that, because we're you know, that mightn't be a good fit, but certainly something has to happen. Something has to happen in the domestic environment, domestic religious practice of whatever form, whether it be Lectio Divina is huge nowadays in small groups. You can do that in a family setting as well as, you know, in a larger group setting. There's all sorts of things. And I'm sure there are all sorts of new shoots happening within the domestic environment. And we'll only see that, I think, as we look back on this period, maybe 20 years, 30 years, 50 years hence, as to what actually came. So, so there's certainly hope. Absolutely. I wouldn't deny that.
Yes, I think as well to remember that maybe now it's going to be the part of the laity that will design it. The one thing that you started at the beginning of this split between laity and the church itself. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen, for that comment and question, and thank you, Salvador, for your paper.